Question 69, Mill and Bentham, a Comparative Study. Introduction. The two pillars of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, 1748 to 1832, and John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873, are the two most important figures in the development of utilitarianism, the ethical and political philosophy that judges actions by their utility, that is, their tendency to promote happiness or pleasure and reduce pain or suffering. While both thinkers shared the same moral foundation, the principle of utility, their approaches and interpretations differed significantly. Bentham's utilitarianism was quantitative, mechanical, and individualistic, while Mill's was qualitative, humanistic, and liberal. Thus, Mill built upon Bentham's foundation, but refined it into a more moral and intellectual doctrine, suitable for modern democratic and social thought. 1. Basis of their philosophy. Bentham and Mill both belonged to the British empirical and utilitarian tradition, but their philosophical temperaments were different. Bentham was a legal reformer and social engineer, concerned with codifying a rational system of ethics and law based on measurable pleasure and pain. Mill, by contrast, was a moral philosopher and liberal humanist, concerned with individual character, freedom, and higher moral values. Bentham sought to make ethics scientific and mathematical, whereas Mill sought to make it humane and qualitative. Example. Bentham asked, "How much pleasure does this action produce?" Mill asked, "What kind of pleasure does this action produce?" 2. Principle of utility. Both philosophers agreed that the ultimate aim of all human actions is happiness, and that the right action is one that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. However, their interpretations differed. Bentham's view. The principle of utility should be applied quantitatively. Happiness can be measured in terms of intensity, duration, certainty, and extent, as in his hedonistic calculus. The focus was on the amount of pleasure produced. Example, if two actions produce equal quantities of pleasure, both are equally good regardless of their nature. Example, playing cards or studying philosophy. Mill's view. Mill accepted the same principle but introduced a qualitative distinction: not all pleasures are equal in kind. Some pleasures, like intellectual and moral ones, are higher and more valuable than physical or sensual ones. He famously stated, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." Hence, Mill elevated utilitarianism from a mere calculus of pleasure to a moral philosophy of human improvement. 3. Concept of pleasure. Bentham's quantitative hedonism. Bentham believed pleasure is homogeneous and measurable. All pleasures differ only in degree, not kind. He proposed a philosophic calculus to quantify pleasure using factors such as intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and extent. For Bentham, quantity of pleasure determines moral value. If playing pushpin brings as much pleasure as poetry, both are equally valuable. Mill's qualitative hedonism. Mill argued that pleasures differ not only in degree but also in kind. Some are higher, intellectual, aesthetic, moral, and some lower, sensual, bodily. He believed the quality of pleasure should matter more than mere quantity. According to Mill, a competent judge, someone who has experienced both, will always prefer higher pleasures because they engage the higher faculties of human nature. Example, The joy of learning, creativity, or moral satisfaction is superior to the temporary thrill of eating or gambling. 4. View on human nature. Bentham's mechanical view. Bentham viewed human beings as pleasure-seeking and pain-avoiding machines motivated purely by self-interest. He saw humans as rational calculators who measure every action by how much pleasure or pain it yields. Mill's humanistic view. Mill had a more idealistic and moral conception of human nature. He believed humans are not mere seekers of physical pleasure, but are capable of moral growth, sympathy, and self-improvement. He saw happiness as a process of development, not mere gratification. Thus, for Mill, utilitarianism must cultivate character and moral sensibility, not just maximize sensual pleasure. 5. Ethical orientation. Bentham quantitative and external. Bentham's utilitarianism was external and behavioral. It measured morality by observable consequences and external results. Mill qualitative and internal. Mill's utilitarianism was internal and psychological. It emphasized motives, conscience, and moral sentiments. He believed happiness depends not only on external pleasure but also on inner peace, moral satisfaction, and self-respect. Example: a philanthropist who helps others out of compassion achieves higher happiness than one who donates merely for fame. 6. View on liberty and individual rights. Bentham was primarily a legal utilitarian. He saw rights as creations of law, not natural or inherent. He famously called natural rights nonsense upon stilts, meaning they have no meaning without legal authority. For him, the law must serve the greatest happiness of society, even if that limits some individual's liberty. Mill, in contrast, was the philosopher of liberty. In his classic work on liberty, 1859, he defended individual freedom as essential to human happiness and progress. He formulated the harm principle, which states, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community, against his will, is to prevent harm to others." Mill thus balanced utility with individual rights, arguing that personal liberty leads to collective happiness in the long run. Example: freedom of speech, even if it offends some, promotes truth and progress, thereby serving overall utility. 7. Political and social philosophy. Bentham's legal and institutional focus. Bentham applied utilitarianism to law reform and public administration. He sought to create a rational legal system governed by the principle of utility. Every law should aim at maximizing public happiness. His influence led to reforms in prisons, education, and parliamentary procedure in 19th century England. Mill's moral and democratic focus. Mill extended utilitarianism to moral education, democracy, and women's rights. He emphasized the development of moral individuality, freedom of expression, and representative government as the true instruments of social happiness. Example: Mill supported women's suffrage and argued for education as a means to moral progress, reflecting a broader, human-centered utilitarianism. 8. Approach to justice and morality. For Bentham, justice was the aggregate of individual utilities. Whatever benefits the majority is just. He treated justice as a calculation of collective pleasure and pain. Mill reconciled justice with moral feelings and social sympathy. In Utilitarianism, 1861, he argued that justice is a moral sentiment rooted in human conscience. People desire justice because it serves the happiness of all in the long run. Thus, Mill integrated moral psychology into utilitarian ethics, making it less mechanical and more humane. 9. Role of the state. Bentham minimalist state. Bentham supported a strong but limited state, whose primary duty was to enforce laws and prevent harm, not to interfere in personal or economic affairs. His economic philosophy was laissez-faire, trusting the free market to promote general happiness. Mill welfare-oriented state. Mill recognized that unrestrained capitalism led to inequality and social injustice. He supported state intervention in education, labor conditions, and poverty alleviation, not to control individuals, but to enable them to develop their capacities. Thus, Bentham's utilitarianism was negative, freedom from interference, while Mill's was positive, freedom through opportunity. 10. Influence and legacy. Bentham, father of classical utilitarianism, laid the foundations for modern legal and administrative reform. His philosophy shaped the British legal system, penal reforms, and early democratic thought. Mill refined and humanized utilitarianism, father of liberal utilitarianism and modern liberal democracy. His writings on liberty, individuality, and women's rights continue to influence political and ethical thought. Bentham gave utilitarianism its scientific structure. Mill gave it moral depth and human spirit. Summary for quick understanding. Bentham and Mill both believed in the principle of utility, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. However, Bentham's utilitarianism was quantitative, empirical, and legalistic, while Mill's was qualitative, moral, and liberal. Bentham viewed humans as pleasure-maximizing beings, while Mill saw them as moral and rational individuals capable of higher development. Bentham emphasized law and reform, Mill emphasized liberty, character, and moral progress. Together, they shaped modern utilitarian and liberal philosophy, Bentham as the founder, Mill as the reformer. Quick revision notes. Bentham quantitative, legal, mechanical, external, reform-oriented. Mill qualitative, moral, liberal, humanistic, freedom-oriented. Bentham quantity of pleasure, Mill quality of pleasure. Bentham rights as legal constructs, Mill rights as moral guarantees. Bentham laissez-faire, Mill welfare intervention. Bentham reform of law, Mill reform of human character. Bentham pushpin equal to poetry, Mill better Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. One-line questions and answers for revision. 1. Who is the founder of classical utilitarianism? Jeremy Bentham. 2. Who refined utilitarianism into a moral philosophy? John Stuart Mill. 3. What is Bentham's view of pleasure? Quantitative, all pleasures are equal in kind. 4. What is Mill's view of pleasure? Qualitative, higher and lower pleasures differ in kind. 5. What did Bentham call natural rights? Nonsense upon stilts. 6. What principle did Mill formulate in On Liberty? The harm principle. 7. What kind of utilitarianism did Bentham represent? Legal and quantitative. 8. What kind did Mill represent? Liberal and qualitative. 9. What did Bentham focus on? Law, reform, and measurable happiness. 10. What did Mill focus on? Freedom, moral development, and human dignity. Final connection. Bentham and Mill stand as two stages in the evolution of utilitarian thought, Bentham as the architect of its rational framework, and Mill as the artist of its moral soul. Bentham sought to measure happiness, Mill sought to elevate it. Bentham made utilitarianism practical, Mill made it philosophical. Together, they transformed the principle of utility into one of the greatest ethical and political doctrines of modern civilization, uniting reason, reform, and humanity in the pursuit of the greatest happiness of all.